Finally. Hey, I've got an interesting story to tell you. John Young of Cryptome, who's a dear member of our community and an incredible archivist who has released some amazing information that people have leaked to them over the years, long before Julian Assange and others. And I called John and I said, John, do you have any good talks for Hope X? He's like, let me tell you, Bernie, I have the guy for you. Ray Novoselsky is going to be a real sleeper talk this year. Not something you had not heard much about, but he lives here in New York. He works as a freelance producer for the Emmy-nominated series Vice on HBO. How many of you have seen that? Quite a few hands. It's first class TV. A lot of people came out to support Ray after the CIA threatened him and his colleagues with prosecution under a law called the Intelligence Identities Protection Act. Why? Well, he's going to explain why, but basically he contacted the agency requesting that two of their employees respond to some serious allegations, which were later detailed in a 90-minute investigative podcast that he put together entitled Who Was Rich Blee? Now, an advocate for government and corporate transparency and accountability, Ray has written for Salon and Truth Out and contributed to investigations to the Daily Beast and Gawker. But he's going to tell you a bone-chilling story of how official persecution and pressure was put on him to keep a story under wraps that the CIA did not want told. So this is whistleblowing at its finest. Ray Novoselsky.
Hey, everybody. This is going to be a little bit of a right turn from the previous subject. When I was told that I had the... I can't see any of you, by the way. It's very bright. When I was told that I had the 10 p.m. Friday night time slot, I sort of assumed there'd be 5 people sitting here. Honestly, it's kind of freaking me out. And I don't have a lot of history of public speaking, so I'm going to do my best, but go easy on me. I want to thank Bernie. I want to thank John Young from Cryptome for suggesting me. Honored to be in the Chelsea Manning room. Honored to be here the day before Ed Snowden's going to be calling in. So let's see if this works. I'm probably the least techie person to have ever been invited to speak here, as will be evidenced by me playing all this just directly off my laptop. World meet Alfreda Francis Bukowski. I apologize that this picture is a little bit low res, but it was leaked to Cryptome here recently from her high school yearbook. This was her when she was 17. Today, as far as we know, she's still the head of the CIA's Global Jihad Unit, which basically means that she and the director of the Counterterror Center at CIA run the war on terror for the CIA. And up until recently, she's been credited with running the drones kill list program. She has a long history. I'm told by a source that she was the person most credited with the successful assassination of Osama bin Laden, likely one of the bases for the Jessica Chastain character in Zero Dark 30. Let's see here. I'm just going to be droning on about CIA for the next hour, so really if anybody just wants to head to the bar and get a drink, it's okay. Also, let me say that if anybody has any questions, I have a feeling I'm going to run up right to the end of the hour, so just yell them out to me. Let's make this really informal, okay? Any point you need clarity or you just want to discuss something a little more, just let me know. So I'm going to actually, for the next hour, talk about who this woman is, how we know, and why we should care. And I thought I'd begin with my conclusions, state them right up front, and then you can kind of tell me if, at the end, if I came to the right ones. So, number one, the unprecedented rise in government secrecy over the last decade and a half does not actually protect national security. It actually endangers it. And I think that's a really important point. Often when we talk about transparency or we talk about this growth in secrecy, people make the point that it undermines democracy. And that's absolutely true. But I think another strong argument, as will be sort of shown by the story of this woman, is that it really makes us less safe. It puts our lives in danger. Number two, secrecy has allowed individuals in the CIA and probably throughout the intelligence and military communities to basically go rogue. And that sounds a little extreme, but basically what I mean is that they are able to take actions that have great negative effects without being known about and without having to fear accountability in any way. Number three, our intelligence agencies' systems for checks and balances, for oversight and accountability, have become broken. People in those agencies, I think, understand that reality, and they feel little fear about any consequences. And so from their bosses at the CIA, or their bosses in the White House, to Congress's oversight committees, to the Inspector General, or outside prosecutors, the system of justice has been thoroughly compromised. When people argue that Edward Snowden should have stayed within the system to air his grievances, they don't understand how impossible that has become. Number four, the rise in whistleblowers and leakers that we're seeing, to some may seem extreme, but it is a reaction to the extreme secrecy that has overtaken our country over the last decade and a half. And so I think as we go through this, I'm going to talk about a number of whistleblowers regarding this story, and we can kind of understand where they might be coming from. I believe they're trying to tip the scales back to just some sort of sanity. Lastly, early in Bukowski's career, I think the lines were a lot clearer between what is illegal and what is not illegal. And particularly as a result of her actions, and partially due in general to the air in Washington, I would argue that the rule of law has become compromised to the point where it's largely been replaced by the sort of idea of rule of man. Rule of law being there's a set of rules and all of us sort of are beholden to them. Rule of man being that basically on a case-by-case basis the law will be decided, let's say by the president, who essentially has become judge and jury. And this has resulted in a two-tiered system of justice, one for us and one for the people working in areas of power, which goes without saying it's a little dangerous. Sorry to do this, but I got to plug my laptop in. Anybody seen any good movies lately? Okay, so I thought I'd jump real fast to the whole, who the hell am I and why am I talking about the CIA thing? So I was raised in the Midwest. I went to Columbia College in Chicago. I started school hoping to be the next Alfred Hitchcock, and by the end I kind of wanted to be a little bit of a slightly libertarian Michael Moore. Within a few years of graduating, I just wanted to get paid to do some work. I want to kind of address this one right off the bat. I'm going to be mentioning 9/11 a good little bit. So I want to clear this up straight off. I'm not a truther. I'm passionate about transparency and accountability. And frankly, 9/11 opened a whole can of worms in terms of failure across the board within government and practically launched an accountability movement on its own. And that's kind of where I came in. Back in 2006, my colleague Rory O'Connor, colleague John Duffy, and I completed a documentary called Press for Truth. It told the story of 4 women who were housewives and mothers in New Jersey, had been largely apolitical prior to 9/11, and lost their husbands in the Twin Towers. They felt that there were some some holes that needed filled within the system, some people that needed accountability, problems that needed gotten to the bottom of. And they thought it would be fairly easy to get a 9/11 commission called, but they ended up struggling for several years to get to lobby politicians to teach themselves how to work the media and so forth. And so they eventually got the 9/11 commission called, and we told their story. By the time we got to the end of that, I didn't want to think about 9/11 ever again, or at least not for a long time. And coincidentally, the same month that our movie came out, one of the widows, Kristen Breitweiser, released a book called Wake Up Call. And it was mostly a memoir of her journey, but she chose to devote an entire chapter to something she calls footnote 44. And reading that chapter, we started on a new journey that eventually brought us to Alfreda Bukowski. So I'm going to go ahead and let Tom Kean, former New Jersey governor and the chairman of the 9/11 Commission, read that footnote from his book to you. Hopefully the audio is good.
Chapter 6 of the report. Book point for you.
Okay. Footnote 44. The CIA cable. That's the right one? Yes, yes. Activities of bin Laden associate Khalid revealed January 4th, 2000. His Saudi passport, which contained a visa for travel to the United States, was photocopied and forwarded to CIA headquarters. This information was not shared with FBI headquarters until August 2001. An FBI agent detailed to the bin Laden unit at CIA attempted to share this information with colleagues at FBI headquarters. A CIA desk officer instructed him not to cable with him. Several hours later, the same desk officer drafted a cable distributed solely within CIA, alleging that it had been shared. She admitted she did not personally share the information and cannot identify who told us that they had been shared. We were unable to locate anyone who claimed to have shared this information. Contemporaneous documents contradict the claim that they were shared. Oh, it wasn't careless oversight. It was purposeful. No question about that in my mind. It was purposeful, but it's purposeful because we believe these agencies had been brought up to hold everything tight. That in the DNA of these organizations was secrecy. And secrecy to the point of you don't share it with anybody. You don't share it with your fellow agencies, you don't share it with other government officials, you keep everything right there. And that's what they did in this case. Now, it's one of the most troubling aspects of our entire report, that particular thing.
So what he's talking about is going to become clearer as we go, but basically, we became aware of this incident that, Jane Mayer of The New Yorker, Michael Isikoff of Newsweek have called one of the greatest intelligence failures in U.S. history. And come to find out, Alfreda Bukowski was at the center of that, basically launched her career that way. And so we collected a number of interviews trying to put together a documentary that we never quite got funded, and eventually that interview you just saw was part of that. Eventually we gave up. And then what happened was, late 2010, Cablegate happened. And, the bravery of Chelsea Manning, the bravery of Julian Assange, whatever you want to say about him, we found it inspiring. And we decided that we were just going to sort of continue doing interviews up to the 9/11 10th anniversary the following year, just do them by phone, do them on the cheap, put this all together into what we called an investigative podcast, which is basically a made-up thing. But it was like a 90-minute audio documentary. The idea was, we'll exercise this from our souls, put this out in the world, and people can take the info and do whatever they want with it. And at the same time, this woman who had won the Time Magazine Person of the Year in 2002, Colleen Rowley, She had been an FBI whistleblower that had sort of complained about problems she had had pre-9/11 with people at FBI headquarters kind of stymieing her investigations and so forth. She wrote an article called, WikiLeaks and 9/11, What If? And she made this really interesting argument, which was that, essentially, had there been something available like WikiLeaks when she was having her problems, perhaps they could have gone around FBI headquarters and they could have, gotten this information to the public and caused some kind of a sea change that could have perhaps prevented 9/11. And that reminded us of something that that we had been, that Kristen Breitweiser, one of the 9/11 widows, had said on Hardball, a similar case. So let me play this. Come on. I don't get that joke. Okay. Here we go. Everything is not the CIA. All right, well, that's not working out, so I'll keep going. Wait. So let me skip ahead a little. We had interviewed Richard Clarke, who was the top man for counterterror in the White House. He had been the White House counterterror czar. So basically, you couldn't go. Oh, here's the clip I wanted to play. Basically, you couldn't go any higher up in the totem pole as far as counterterror goes. And he had accused George Tenet of some pretty serious stuff. George Tenet was the head of the CIA. So we went ahead and sent George Tenet an email. And we were surprised when we got an immediate response with a letter from Tenet. And so we felt like we were kind of onto something here, because for the first time, Tenet, along with this guy named Rich Blee and Cofer Black, felt the need to address their pre-9/11 mistakes in an actual letter. It was the first time they'd done anything like that publicly. Our podcast was going to be focused on this guy, Rich Blee, because we saw him as sort of a symbol. For 10 years following 9/11, his name had never appeared in the mainstream media, yet he was the head of the CIA's Bin Laden station. And so we just thought there was something wrong with that, because if there had been a massive intelligence failure, then it seems like the buck would stop at the head of the CIA's Bin Laden station. And so over the course of investigating this, we came to figure out that there was a woman who was sort of at the heart of all of this story with the pre-9/11 shenanigans, who had been working under Rich Blee. But she is sort of referenced here and there, always sort of alluded to in these various books and documents over the last 10 years, but had never been named, and you really wouldn't know it was the same person. Until this article came out, early 2011, it was an Associated Press article, and it was all about how the grave mistakes had been made by this person named Frances, middle name Frances, and the article revealed that she had an awkward first name. So our team, we basically started just Googling, and we went to the State Department nominations. They post those, and a lot of times they're fronts for CIA covers. So we just started searching Frances year by year in State Department postings. And I think it was the 2008 or 2009 one, we found an Alfreda Frances Bukowski. Kind of an unusual first name, middle name Frances. It seemed right. So during interviews with various people in preparation for this documentary, we started just kind of pulling one of these, where we would say, would that order have come from Rich Blee, or would it have been more likely to have come from Alfreda Bukowski? And when people would kind of go, oh, it could have been either of them, when that happened a number of times, we started to get a lot more confident that this was the name. So at a certain point, we emailed the CIA. And that email said, we wish to make you aware that we plan to release an investigative podcast and written piece which will name two of your employees, Alfreda Francis Bukowski and Michael Ann Casey. The evidence we have uncovered demonstrates that each failed to follow standard operating procedure on multiple instances with regard to an operation that surveilled two future 9/11 hijackers, one that many we interviewed feel was the single best opportunity to stop the attacks. Regarding Ms. Bukowski specifically, we have learned that she may have misinformed the congressional investigation on certain details. We have also confirmed that she is the CIA employee reprimanded for making herself involved in the waterboarding of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed without officially being assigned to do so. And another source says she was named for accountability into the Camp Chapman attack. So, I was told ahead of time that when we sent that email, we should be ready for a phone call pretty fast, and that happened. And a guy named Preston Golson, who was the CIA's media spokesperson, said, hey, Ray, I got your email. This is Preston from CIA. And I immediately said, hold on, I'm going to record this. And I started to. And he said, whoa, hold on, man. What are we, let's just have a little informal talk here. So we did, and I sent him the transcript of the podcast. So I basically gave him everything I had and said, this is what we've uncovered, this is who told us what. We would like to interview her. If we've gotten anything wrong, we would love for her to tell us her side of the story. The response that I received So, this is off the record, guys. We strongly believe it's a potential violation of federal criminal law to print the names of two reported undercover CIA officers whom you claim have been involved in the hunt against al-Qaeda. Later, I asked him to cite the law. He specifically said the Intelligence Identities Protection Act. Now, maybe he was just trying to scare us, but I have, and it works, I have never gotten a message from CIA telling me I might be criminally liable for something. And so we took it seriously, and we basically announced online that we were going to pause on the release of the documentary for the 9/11 10th anniversary, and we were going to investigate our options. And so I called up Ben Weisner. He's the head of the ACLU's National Security Project. And to be honest with you, his advice was not comforting. What he said was that, and I'm paraphrasing, but yes, this law has never been used to prosecute journalists in the past. That being said, it's clear that the administration is looking to extend precedent in that area. And when they do it, it's not going to be Bob Woodward they go after. It's going to be a couple of knuckleheads like yourselves. So tread lightly. So we made a decision that I'm not terribly proud of, but let me go ahead and defend it ahead of time. We censored the podcast. We put little alias names with a mechanical voice every time the people were mentioned so that it would stand out. And we had the intention of sort of making a bigger stink about this whole thing by sort of launching a campaign that would be like, why won't the CIA let you know who these people are? And then we could regroup at a later time. But although we tried to wimp out in that regard, the universe had other ideas. And our webmaster, on the day that we released the censored podcast, our webmaster, JR, basically accidentally, I swear, he was supposed to post all sorts of our email exchanges between us and CIA, and he posted the unredacted one on an obscure section of our website. And I found this out because I was basically just Googling some stuff that evening and saw it come up on Cryptome, Alfreda Bukowski. This is her name. And I quickly realized what had happened. I asked John to take JR to take it on down. But by that point, it was too late, and by the next morning, I was getting a call from John Cook at Gawker. At the time, I was kind of just trying to lay low and see if this whole thing would blow over. I had a journalist friend who's well connected who, I don't know who his source is, but he claimed that his source had told him that there was at least an investigation opened at the Justice Department. And we had spent 3 months sort of unpaid just finishing this podcast. And so, we were running on fumes. I was starting a new job that was requiring me to go into an office, do long hours, concentrate on that, and all I could think about is whether there were going to be federal agents looking to question me when I got home. So, let's see here. I knew this speech was going to run longer than I wanted it to, so let me just jump ahead. I want to tell you, basically, prior to her naming, there are subtle references to her in the Congressional 9/11 report, in the 9/11 Commission report, in the Department of Justice 9/11 Commission report, and in Lawrence Wright's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Looming Tower. Those came out in 2003, 2004, and 2006, respectively. But they didn't even give her an alias. There wasn't, what they would, if some guy was named Mark, they'd call him Marty, so that you could at least sort of track and follow the story. But she never had an alias in any of those, so you wouldn't even know she existed. Finally, in March of 2007, Ken Silverstein wrote an article for Harper's where he referenced a woman. She was described as a person who inspires little confidence and who is highly adept at working her way through the bureaucracy but has no leadership ability. She had been nominated and then, after that article, denominated for the role of Baghdad Station Chief. And then in 2008, Jane Mayer came out with an excellent book called The Dark Side. If you haven't read it, please do. She references a tall, pale-skinned, spiky-haired redhead who wore bright red lipstick and was controversial among her male colleagues for her ferociousness, who got so excited when the 9/11 mastermind was captured that she took a trip to Poland on her own dime, unassigned, to participate in his waterboarding, and was later scolded and told it's not supposed to be entertainment. And then there's a few obscure references here and there, and we get to the Adam Goldman Matapuzzo story in the Associated Press. Now, people might ask, why do you need to name names? Why not just report about a CIA officer that made mistakes and sort of let it kind of, if it becomes a public thing, if Congress looks into it, whatever, people will get to the bottom of it. And to that, I would say 11 years, 10 months. 11 years, 10 months between the first alleged act of criminality that I can point to in Alfreda Bukowski's career to the date when we, the public, could begin to put the pieces together and understand what was going on. 6 of America's finest journalists, 4 government investigation reports, and it took Cryptome to let the public finally know what was really going on. So that is why I would argue we need extremist transparency orgs like Cryptome and WikiLeaks. Any questions up to this point? I know I'm just I think I'm halfway through my time and I'm just about to get into the meat of this, but. Yeah, all right, that's a very good question. Statement. I don't know if all of them knew her name, but presumably they did. Presumably they could have at least asked. If they had a source that was telling them information, they could have gotten some sort of a pseudonym. I know in the case of Jane Mayer, she was told, basically the CIA lies to these journalists, and because they are mainstream journalists, they do kind of defer to, well, they told us this, so we can't put someone in harm's way. What they said to Jane Mayer, as I understand it, is that, Alfreda Bukowski was on an overseas mission and was undercover. So you could see why you wouldn't want. To my understanding, that has never happened. She has always been a manager analyst working safely from CIA headquarters, and she is known to dine at this one Washington eatery on a regular basis and so forth. So that was a bold-faced lie. And then in the case of the Associated Press, I'm told they were going to release her name right off, and they got convinced, I think by Preston Golson, to just, well, what's the harm, and why don't you just go with the middle name? That'll give people a way to identify her, and it sure did. Little background on her real fast. She's from Garland, Texas. She went to Garland South High School. Then she went to University of Pennsylvania and on to the Fletcher School up in Massachusetts. She arrived at CIA in the early 90s. I believe it was January 1991. And she sort of immediately connected with this group of women who were sort of all newbies to the agency, all kind of trying to stick together in this man's world of the agency. And one of those people who kind of becomes important throughout the rest of this is a woman named Jennifer Matthews, who kind of became her best friend. There was the CIA gentleman named Mike Scheuer, and he had founded in 1995 something called Alex Station, which was basically the Al-Qaeda office. It started out with like 25 people. By the time 9/11 happened, it had 50 people. Very small office, working in open cubicles, everybody sort of over each other's shoulders, everybody knowing what each other is doing. And he sort of raised eyebrows because he filled the entire staff almost with analysts, these young female analysts who had just arrived a few years before. The fact that they were female doesn't matter. But the fact is that as analysts, they had no operational experience. They were basically a bunch of bookworms, and they were all, in their late 20s for the most part. And so they developed this reputation within CIA for being almost cult-like in their sort of walking in lockstep together and their sort of what was considered extreme views at the time. That's significant because after 9/11, basically there was this hunger for people who knew anything about Al-Qaeda, and so they all instantly got promoted, and their office kind of became the powerhouse office of the CIA. And so this group that got referred to by other people at CIA as the Manson family came to run the CIA essentially, and eventually sort of their philosophies became general United States government philosophy. Let me go ahead and bring this one up if it'll cooperate with me. This is a few folks. Yeah. Open with. I really hate that you can all see what I'm doing here, but what's up? Help me. Okay. Oh, good. Now you can see. Okay. So I mentioned Michael Scheuer, founder of Alex Station. He got let go basically in '99 and replaced with this guy Rich Blee, right up at the top. Also the only known photo of him. Blee was basically the son of like CIA royalty from the old Cold War days, and he had grown up in the agency and arrived at Alex Station to try to take a more proactive approach to Al-Qaeda. His deputy chief was Thomas Wilshire, and Alfredo Bukowski basically became like the lead analyst, the manager that was overseeing the other, let's say, 47 Alex Station employees, which included her good friend Jennifer Matthews and Michael Ann Casey. So, in January of 2000, this is when we get into sort of the meat of the 9/11 intelligence failure, the NSA had been monitoring an Al-Qaeda communications hub in Yemen. And I want to be clear, the NSA was not monitoring every house in Yemen and came across this hub. The FBI had actually gotten it doing an interrogation of a terror suspect and got the phone number, and they got a court order, and they actually started monitoring this house because it was being used by Al-Qaeda. And they found out there was going to be a big meeting in Malaysia. And so Jennifer Matthews, who was basically held the ticket or was sort of like in charge of the case regarding anything with Yemen, got alerted to the whole thing because they were going to be traveling from Yemen to Malaysia. And Michael Ann Casey basically got the ticket on the op itself. So she coordinated, I think it was something like 10 different CIA field offices, 7 foreign intelligence organizations, and they managed to at least monitor the outside of this meeting and see who was meeting there. And they took photos. And it was a who's who of Al-Qaeda leaders. Here is Jack Clunan, a former FBI counterterror agent, talking about how big a deal this particular meeting is.
Like, I believe Hambali, Ramzi bin al-Sheed was there. Nashiri. I mean, those
it's like the who's who. I mean, to put all these players in one location at one point, it's just hard to believe. I mean, how fortuitous. Well, that's what you were always looking for. I mean, that's what everything was promulgated on. I mean, you were always looking for, the threat to the United States and were there people coming in. We knew from talking to other cooperatives what a price and a value that bin Laden and Zawahiri put on getting people in Al-Qaeda with a U.S. passport or the ability to travel to the United States.
So, inside Alex Station, we have a little bit of a spy of our own because the FBI sent over its own guy, Mark Rossini, to basically be attached to the bin Laden station at the time. And so he can kind of give us a window into what was happening in January of 2000.
Well, the cable came in. They had gone back to the consulate in Jeddah, pulled his visa papers, and of course, attached to the cable were all the all the information about him, and that he had implied that he wished to go to the United States. And then my colleague Doug Miller then took it upon himself to write what they call the CIR, the Central Intelligence Report, to inform the FBI about this meeting in Malaysia in particular, and because of the fact that one of the people there, a suspected terrorist, had intentions to travel to the U.S. So the way it works over there is you write a communication and then it goes into an electronic queue to get approved along the line to be released. Obviously, me being the more senior agent, Doug comes to me. It was like the next day or the day after. Just came up to my little cubicle area and said, "Hey, I don't know what the fuck is going on," or in words to that effect, or "Hey, can you help me out here? I don't know why this thing isn't moving." So I said, "Sure, let me go up and let me go talk to Michelle, see what's going on." And I said, "Hey, Doug's cable, what's going on? It's not going out the door. You got to send it to the bureau. It's not moving. What's happening?" She got a little heated. And that's when she said,
"Listen, it's not an FBI case. It's not an FBI matter. And we want the FBI to know what to know. And you're not going to say anything." And
I was like, "Okay, if that's your posture, that's your position. Well, all right. I don't agree with it because someone has the guy's got a visa to come to the U.S. But that was really that was the end of it."
So basically, what began there, nobody really knows what the motivation was. A lot of people think they hated John O'Neill, who was the head of the New York office of the FBI, and they didn't want him to get another big catch. Who knows? Who knows what they were working on? The point is that they did not share the information. And that was maybe no big deal, just a breach of protocol, until late November of 2000, when the USS Cole was bombed. It turns out the meeting that they had surveilled was both an initial planning meeting for 9/11, the one in Malaysia, as well as the planning meeting for the Cole. And some of the people who were plotters for each were all at the same meeting. So John O'Neill's crack FBI team goes out to Yemen, headed by this investigator named Ali Soufan. And as Soufan's investigating, not using torture, using age-old techniques like following old detective trails and doing sort of old-school interrogations. He begins to figure out that the people who masterminded the Cole had all been together in Malaysia in January of 2000. So he submits an official request to CIA. Says, do you know anything about any kind of a meeting in Malaysia in January of 2000? Have any more info for us? Put yourself in their shoes. What was simply a breach of protocol in January of 2000, by November of 2000, has now become their asses are on the line for culpability for the USS Cole attack. If they come clean at that point, they've got to admit that they knew information about guys who eventually attacked the Cole and didn't provide it to anyone. So what do? They double down. And I'll spare you the details, although they're out there. And if you want to listen to our podcast, Who is Rich Blee, Google it, and you'll get all the details. But basically, the long and short of it is, for the next several months leading up to 9/11, they run a series of little games on the FBI team. They respond three different times. They do not have any more information on the Cole bombing. Something Lawrence Wright, the Pulitzer Prize winner, calls obstruction of justice in the death of 17 U.S. sailors because it was an ongoing FBI investigation. And in the end, ironically, on 9/11, the FBI men who'd been sort of kept in the dark during that whole period, the Cole investigators, they lost their mentor and leader, John O'Neill, who was in the World Trade Center and died that day. And so the next day, Ali Soufan's in Yemen, and he's getting ready to go to the airport and fly back to New York to begin the 9/11 investigation. And he gets pulled aside and he gets handed a file folder. Now, this is all according to a book that he came out with at the same time as Alfredo Bukowski's name came out, called The Black Banners. Also highly recommended reading. But he gets handed a file, and it contains the photos of all the people who were meeting in Malaysia in January 2000, the one he'd made 3 requests for. And as he writes, my hands started shaking. I didn't know what to think. He ran to the bathroom and threw up. Sat on the floor for the next few minutes, but it felt like hours. What I'd just seen went through my mind again and again. The same thought kept looping back. If they had all this information since January 2000, why the hell didn't they pass it on? So, September 15th, 2001, the CIA presents a plan of action to President Bush at Camp David and reportedly wows him. They provide what is basically their wildest dreams wish list. And afterwards, George Tenet comes up to Bush. We don't know exactly what got said, but what's been reported is that he came up and shook his hand and said, listen, the men and women of the CIA need to know that you've got their back, that there's not going to be any kind of witch hunt. And true to Bush's character, he kind of just went, that sounds good, shook his hand, and that was going to be that. 2 days later, signs an executive order that greenlights the Black Site program, the Targeted Kill program, gives them, I think it almost doubled their budget, and lets them, for the first time in U.S. history, lead a military campaign, essentially, into Afghanistan. So it's like Christmas there. And let me pull up my second CIA sheet here. Basically, everybody gets promoted. So by about mid-2002, this is how things look. Mike Scheuer, who'd been let go, gets brought back as a special advisor. Alfredo Bukowski is now chief of Alex Station. At the Counterterror Center, a new guy named Jose Rodriguez has appeared. Thanks to Cryptome, we now know that his deputy was a guy named Michael DeAndre, who is now himself the head of Counterterror Center. Jennifer Matthews gets her own high-value target unit to run with a bunch of basically young, next-generation young targeters that are coming in. If you've seen Zero Dark 30, they're kind of like that. And so everything's coming up George Tenet and CIA until November, when he gets briefed by the CIA historian. And the historian basically tells him, look, I got a little bad news. It turns out that some of your guys down at Alex Station knew about two 9/11 hijackers a year and a half prior and sort of did not provide that information to anyone. And Tenet kind of flips out. And we don't know what happened after that, but we can presume that he had some sort of a come-to-Jesus meeting with them. And it seems that the decision was made to not come clean about that, because the email that you heard Mark Rossini describe, that Doug Miller attempted to send to FBI, the one that he was categorically told that he couldn't send, that was in the electronic database of CIA. But it's sort of 4 investigations into 9/11 happened that looked through those databases, and from November 2001 until it turned back up at the start of 2004, it was sort of nowhere to be found. I'm on my last 10 minutes, so I'm going to jump ahead to the torture program, because the failure to sort of hold them to account the first time around line them up to be part of a whole second set of problems here. One second. So, you might not be a fan of the FBI, but in the case of sort of John O'Neill's FBI, I would look at it as, basically he insisted, they knew that they would need to try people in open court, and so they followed the rules, the basic rules of human dignity, human rights rules, reading Miranda rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so I sort of see them, John O'Neill's people in the FBI, as representing the legal approach, the rule of law, and the CIA folks is kind of anything that gets it done, extra legal approach. And so I don't know how familiar everybody is with the details of the CIA black sites. It's a pretty weird thing to be an aficionado about, I'll be the first to admit. But, basically, I mentioned the Bush executive order, September 17, 2001, greenlit them. But for the first few months after 9/11, right up until about March of 2002, they weren't really sure if they were going to go forward with the torture program. A couple of military psychologists had been contracted to develop it, and they were pushing for torture as the answer. But it wasn't until they captured a guy named Abu Zubaydah in March of 2002 that we had basically our first test case for torture. And what happened was, at the beginning, the CIA, although they had him, they kind of threw together their first black site in Thailand, they didn't really believe that it was him. So they didn't actually send any of their key team members. And so Ali Soufan, who I mentioned from the FBI, he gets called in, a crack interrogator, and he starts working on him. And he gets him to admit a number of things. For the first time, he tells Soufan that the mastermind of 9/11 was this guy Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, which was huge. They didn't know until then who had plotted it, and knowing that, obviously, is kind of a big piece of the puzzle. He also revealed the Jose Padilla Chicago dirty bomb plot. Not long after, sort of, Jennifer Matthews arrives. She has the file on this particular terrorist, Zubaydah, and she comes in along with one of those military psychologists. And they basically tell Ali Soufan, Washington wants to try something a little different, and they begin trying out these various torture techniques. Well, when they aren't effective, Washington gets cold feet, and they bring Ali Soufan sort of back in, and he puts his clothes back on, turns the temperature back up, and starts to try to form a rapport with him. And this goes on for a period of a couple weeks there, from sort of late March into mid-April. It's basically a straight-up A/B test of torture versus the old school stuff. And torture yielded nothing. But Soufan is not in charge of the reporting that's coming back. It's a CIA case, so the CIA is in charge of that. And what happens is that we don't know who the guilty parties are, but we know that the person who would have been reporting back to headquarters was Jennifer Matthews. And we know that the person who was sort of the go-to person for all reports that kind of went upstairs at CIA was Alfredo Bukowski. And they reported what Soufan had gotten through legal interrogation techniques as being the result of waterboarding. I'm not positive, but I think they misled their own higher-ups. And as evidence of that, years after the fact, you may know a guy named John Kiriakou. He's now in prison for the torture program, not for participating in torture, but for revealing it. I think he's got another 3 years. Where's my quick time? All right. But when he went on ABC News and first revealed definitively that the U.S. was engaging in torture, he still believed, if I can pull up this damn clip, he still believed at that time that despite the fact that he was against torture, he had to at least give it props because he said that Zubaida had broken down after one application of waterboarding and basically just started singing. And I think that was probably something that went around CIA, and it also went around the White House. And it's probably, it had to have come from Alfredo Bukowski or from Jennifer Matthews, somewhere involving the people who were inside the black sites at the time. And only thanks to Ali Soufan finally coming out with his book 10 years after the fact did we get a little of the truth there. Let me play this.
Kiriakou says he knows Zubaydah was one of only 2 al-Qaeda leaders subjected to waterboarding.
And was it successful?
It was.
What happened as a result of that?
He resisted. He was able to withstand the waterboarding for quite some time, and by that I mean probably 35 seconds.
That's quite some time.
Which was quite some time. A short time afterwards, in the next day or so, he told his interrogator that Allah had visited him in his cell during the night and told him to cooperate because his...
All right, that may be the last thing I try to play on this piece of crap. So look, this is kind of important.
Cooperation would make it easier on the other brothers who had been captured. And from that day on, he answered every question just like I'm sitting here speaking to you.
So in your view, the waterboarding broke him?
I think it did, yes.
And did it make a difference in terms of...
It did. The threat information that he provided disrupted a number of attacks, maybe dozens of attacks.
So that was bullshit, but I think it was bullshit that he believed because it had been widely circulated within CIA. Here is an important point as I need to wrap up now. It's sort of been understood that the torture program was, however much we might hate it, given legal cover by the Justice Department when Jay Bybee wrote his memo, what they call the Golden Shield memo. But that legal memo has the following statement. It was written at the time of the Abu Zubaydah interrogation, and it says, "Our advice is based upon the following facts which you have provided us. We also understand that you do not have any facts in your possession contrary to the facts outlined here, and this opinion is limited to these facts. If these facts were to change, this advice would not necessarily apply." So, given that the program was greenlit largely on the reporting coming out of the Abu Zubaydah interrogation, and by the end of that year, the military was clamoring to use these same techniques they'd heard were so effective, and so by early 2003 you had Abu Ghraib, etc. You know, they were operating under the idea that they had legal protection based on the reporting coming out of that Thailand black site, which turned out to be inaccurate. If you're, unfortunately, I got to kind of wrap it up, but if you're seeing a theme here, you know, these people being able to operate without oversight within a very secretive environment are able to use that secrecy to sort of manipulate, you know, not just foreign governments like they're trained to do, but it seems like in some cases our own officials. I guess I would jump ahead to Dianne Feinstein. I don't know if you caught this, but recently she caught the CIA investigating her investigators into the CIA torture program and actually removing documents from her investigators' computers. And so she got up and gave this very dramatic 1-hour speech on the floor of the Senate. And I'm going to go ahead and just play this last portion here, because this sort of, to people who aren't following these issues, it may have seemed out of left field, but if you sort of follow this particular story, this sounds like it makes a lot of
If the Senate
part of a pattern.
can find this report, we will be able to ensure that an un-American, brutal program of detention and interrogation will never again be considered or permitted. But, Mr. President, the recent actions that I have just laid out make this a defining moment for the oversight of our Intelligence Committee. How Congress and how this will be resolved will show whether the Intelligence Committee can be effective in monitoring and investigating our nation's intelligence activities.
Sure. Okay. So I'm going to do questions in the back. I just want to say in summation, this speech was called Unmasking a CIA Criminal, but I think it could have been subtitled, How Many Crimes Does a CIA Employee Have to Commit Before He or She is No Longer Allowed to Be a CIA Employee? You know, is the United States better off if the government can keep people like Bukowski a secret? I would say that depends on what we mean by the United States. You know, is it the protection of the government that we're looking for, or the protection of the people? So, thanks for listening to me.
Wherever you go. There's always the issue of connectivity. Even here, we got 5 different wireless networks. As a reminder, there has been a tweet where we want you to use more bandwidth. We want to see if we can max out the connection that we have. There are always issues of connectivity wherever you go, even in your country, wherever you go somewhere else, anywhere else in the world, even if it's just to check silly things online, just to check the news. In other places where you check may be of a more sensitive nature.
But I think it's concerning the aspect ratio as well.
What? Aspect ratio? Yeah. Okay. So check that.
I'm so sorry.
All right. Just check. Okay. Depending on what networks you use, wherever you are, you may need additional security. Inside the U.S., assuming you're U.S. based, you can't always trust where you're going. Outside the U.S., whether it's something as simple as just checking a news report or something a lot more sensitive, you always want to make sure that you have optimum security. Sometimes just to protect from something embarrassing. Other times it can be a much more serious situation. Our next 2 speakers are here to discuss using travel routers to increase your security on the road. And here they are, Ryan Lackey, Mark Rogers.
Hi, thank you. I'm Ryan Lackey. I've worked in crypto for a while. I recently sold my company to Cloudflare, and I've been working on some interesting security stuff since back when I was at Sealand and Haven Co. doing this offshore data haven thing a while ago, about 15 years ago now.
And I'm Mark Rogers, and I break stuff.
Cool. So we're going to talk about using travel routers to hide your traffic and safety. We're going to go over basically why you want to hide your information, some principles of OPSEC. We work a lot with the GRUC, who's really big into applying OPSEC to hacker tradecraft. We're going to show some pretty serious OPSEC fails and people who got burned by them. some of what the technical threats are that you can face, things that can be countered by OPSEC, things that require more technical countermeasures, some of the existing tools and countermeasures to those tools, and then we're going to introduce travel routers and how to use those travel routers to hide. So probably don't need to really put too much time into it, but why do you really want to hide? There's a lot of reasons. We've seen the last couple, maybe 13 months, it's been very, very clear that there are global monitoring systems in place, NSA, GCHQ, but don't forget about the old threats, China, Russia, all sorts of other people monitoring a lot of global traffic. You don't want to get flagged. You don't want to be special. Like, you really don't want special treatment. You want to be completely a normal person that nobody really takes interest in, because the interest they take in you is not usually very good. And there's good reasons just care about privacy. Like, you don't really want, you just personal, like, innate desire for privacy. You're not necessarily somebody who's doing anything really illegal. You're just sort of this normal person. And you've got to prevent some basic threats. You want to prevent, there's a principle that if you have a lot of individual things that are themselves not terribly sensitive, but you put them all together in one place in a big database, that collection of stuff is much more sensitive than any of the individual things. And to be honest, there are times when you're doing stuff where you really don't want to be monitored in specific, where you're doing something that might be illegal under some people's laws, might be high risk, might get you in trouble with people that are very powerful. You want to bypass some things that are totally arbitrary that you don't believe in. You don't want to get detected. And you want to make sure that if you do something and you don't get caught while you're doing it, it doesn't come back to burn you like 20 years later. So there's a whole lot of reasons why you might want to hide. So as I said, we work a lot with the Gruk, this guy who lives in Thailand right now and is pretty awesome, actually. He's studied OPSEC, he studies KGB, he studies all sorts of other people's sort of like operational tradecraft principles, starting from pretty much like the whole Cold War up to now. And he also is a fan of Biggie Small's 10 Crack Commandments, and he converted it to the 10 Commandments of OPSEC. And they're here for you. They're pretty clear. They make a lot of sense, so you should follow these. And then the big question is, what happens when this goes wrong? This is a sort of benign case of when it goes wrong. I don't know if anyone remembers back in 1992, the U.S. invaded a country in the CENTCOM area. Turned out it was not Iraq, it was Somalia in this case. And they sent the Marines in to invade. But apparently the journalists knew that this invasion was going to happen on this beach at a certain time. So there were like 200 journalists on the beach with cameras and rigs and everything, and tents all set up. And then you've got these Marines doing effectively an opposed landing into a bunch of press. So it's pretty hilarious to watch this whole thing. Yeah, so I mean that's like the least bad thing that happens when this kind of stuff goes wrong. And Mark will go into some of these.
Most of the big busts that we've seen over the last 12, 24 months have been because of basic OPSEC failures. Silk Road, arguably the biggest drugs bazaar, probably the first major online drugs bazaar, $1.2 billion in transactions over 2 years. When you look at why Ross Ulbricht was busted, it's pretty obvious. He used his own Gmail when he set up his first account, an account under the name Altoid. He posted jobs for Silk Road to employ people to build stuff under that account. He advertised an early version of Silk Road under that account. He obviously realized at some point that he needed to change things up and that there was a risk, so he then went and retrospectively changed that account to make it anonymous. He changed it to frosty@frosty.com. Frosty@frosty.com then went on to become an admin at Silk Road and was found in the Silk Road keys. He was also seen to post snippets of code to Stack Overflow, asking questions, code that was later found in Silk Road. All of this stuff is really basic. Don't post things using your own name. Don't use your own email address. Don't use your home address. And once you've posted something on the internet, don't think that you can go and change it and delete it, because once it's on the internet, it's out there. That's not how the internet works. Same thing with Sabu. Sabu was busted just at 2 OPSEC failures. Sabu was careful. Sabu spent a lot of his time using Tor. He also spent a lot of his time using IRC. One time he forgot to use Tor. He logged on to IRC using his own details, his home address. That was enough. In today's world, there are people wholesale collecting data just in case. The governments are storing vast amounts of information, and they can retrospectively mine it. So that one time that you log in using your own address is going to be there. And as they search back through history, they'll link it. The other failure was even more basic. If you're going to buy parts for cars using stolen credit cards, don't have them shipped to your home. LulzSec is the same deal. They use personal Facebook accounts to send defacement code. They use their real names as their usernames. They never compartmentalize their stuff. You may be a really cool elite hacker, but if you go and boast that you're a cool elite hacker using your personal account, someone's going to link the two. Separate business and pleasure. Separate your illegal activities from your legal activities. And finally, the jury's kind of out on this last one, Mark Karpelès. I know if anyone here thinks he's innocent, whether he's guilty, but what I do know is when he posted saying that Mt. Gox had been hacked, that it had been taken down using the Bitcoin malleability attack, and that he only had 2,000 Bitcoins left, I and a couple of friends did some very rudimentary tracing using some accounts he'd used before. I don't know if any of you remember when Mt. Gox had its solvency issues the year before, but Mark Karpelès moved around some cash to show that he was actually solvent. And what we did was we went back and we looked at the accounts that he'd moved that cash around to and looked to see what happened to that cash. And what we found was it had been split and moved in some other accounts. And those other accounts held 90,000 Bitcoins. That's quite a bit larger than the 2,000 Bitcoins he was claiming that he had left. And lo and behold, when that accusation was put to him, he suddenly found another 200,000 Bitcoins that he had forgotten about in a wallet. If you're going to steal money from people, at least be smart and try to launder it.
So what are the common mistakes and vulnerabilities that we see that are sort of in common from all these things? I mean, of course, the big threat is always insiders. Either there's infiltration of your organization or somebody gets turned. You bust somebody for some minor thing and then you tell them, oh, you're going to go away for 2 or 3 or 4 times longer than you could ever possibly stand, and they roll over pretty fast. Sometimes people just make mistakes. The problem with OPSEC is you have to get it right pretty much all the time, perfectly. And you make a minor mistake when you're up late at night or when you've done a lot of stuff or something complicated, and it's all gone. It's an all or nothing thing, and you can lose it all in an instant. And then there's data leakage. Just the problem is people are collecting and organizations are collecting such huge volumes of data that it's no longer a case of they have to be looking just at the right time when you mess up. They've got everything. So if you mess up one time, even if they don't catch it then, they'll look and they'll find it. So there's also one of the threats is that people are going to attack your equipment itself. They're going to investigate you, they'll get a hold of your equipment, or they'll get remote access to your equipment. They will look at data that's already on the machine. They'll see if you were using Tor. They'll see if there's any sort of temporary files there, all sorts of stuff like that. There's the fact that there are these global pervasive passive adversaries that are monitoring every single thing. So they can look at backbones, they can look at your local traffic, they can look at the traffic on the remote side. The fact that you might be connecting to servers that are operated by people that are in complete cahoots with whoever your enemy is. If you are connecting to a server in some foreign country, the government in that country is totally on board with the company, is much more likely to side with the organization of the server than you. So if you're sort of like some internet freedom fighter that's going after some infrastructure in, say, Syria, the Syrian government is pretty much, Syrian government, Syrian telco, all those guys are all pretty much one organization. And you might build a threat model around resisting passive threats that works pretty well for you. The problem is there's organizations like NSA that are willing to do a whole range of active plus passive attacks. There's things, the whole quantum series of things that were in the TAO playbook are a combination of a very small active attack combined with a passive attack and passive monitoring. There's malware. There was the attack where the Tor onion router site, the Tor hidden site was compromised with serving malware that would attack specific versions of Mozilla in the Tor browser bundle of people. And there's the fact that they go after the security controls first. They remove your protection first, and then they can unmask you. And then there's, of course, the physical and financial audit trails, all those Bitcoin transaction records, Bitcoin being much more anonymous than a lot of the conventional financial systems. So if you touch money at all, there's usually an audit trail, and it's a very strong audit trail.
So what are they looking for? When someone gets hold of your equipment, the first thing they're going to look for is the low-hanging fruit. They're looking for network logs, content, metadata. The reason it's seen as a low-hanging fruit is it's really easy to collect. You're generating metadata every time you use your machine. It's being stored on your phones, it's being stored on your laptops. It's data about data, and it's seen as low risk. Who cares how many gigabytes of data you send as an email? Who cares about how many emails you send? Who cares about the times that you use your phone or the times you access certain accounts? The answer is they do. It may be quite surprising to you, but the vast majority of metadata isn't encrypted, even when you think your device is. There's been a lot of talk, for example, about the iPhone and how easy it is for law enforcement to acquire forensic information off the iPhone. Most people have speculated things like, there's a flaw in Apple's crypto, or Apple has a backdoor. The reality is, Apple has different levels of storage. Different things are stored in different ways, and some stuff is stored plain text, even when the device is encrypted, because they don't see the need to encrypt it. And this metadata falls into that category. You can access it with physical access to the device and some special tricks from Apple. No sweat. You don't need to break any crypto. You can just pull it down. What can you collect from systems? Well, the list here is huge. The list here is huge, and I think one of the things that should stand out is the vast majority of it is metadata that's not encrypted. It's not protected in any way. It's just there. That doesn't mean to say that you can't control it, and that's kind of the part of some of this talk, is that you can control where your metadata is, if not the creation of your metadata. And if you can control where it is, you can limit people's access to it. Cell phones are even worse in many regards. The amount of data that you can get just from the SIM card in your phone is pretty staggering. With access to a SIM card, I can tell you your phone number, I can tell you which network you're using, I can tell you who you called, I can get location information, I can get ciphering information, and depending on the SIM card, if it's one that's vulnerable, or if you're from an operator that doesn't have strong crypto, I can break it and I can clone it.
So we're basically in the golden age of signals intelligence. It used to be this really hard thing that was only directed against foreign governments and foreign militaries. Now it's kind of something you can do yourself, or that's so easy for governments to do. The marginal cost of each additional target is so low that they can do it pretty much to everybody. SSL still isn't pervasive. I'm actually working on some stuff personally with some people to get SSL much more widely deployed. There's still like single-digit percentages.
Let this sink in. Over the last 12 months, since Snowden's revelations, encrypted traffic has tripled, if not quadrupled in volume. It's gone up from 1 to 2% to 6%. More than 90% of the world's traffic is unencrypted. Why?
And then big data makes, once you have all this data in one place, once you've gathered it, it used to be infeasible to search. Now it's kind of something people do just to target ads better, so it's easy for the government to do with even more money and less profit incentive. Okay, so there's some specific information that's interesting about monitoring IP networks, which is something I care a lot about. IP networks are great, you use them all the time, but even if the data is encrypted that you're sending, you still have to leave a lot of metadata. There's some essential routing information that you just can't hide. There's the IP addresses, source, destination, ports, the sizes and patterns of your flows, traffic type. All this stuff is essentially like part of the addressing information. You can't get rid of it or it'll stop working. And then the content, even if it's unencrypted, there's a lot of information you can gather just from the patterns of encrypted data versus the contents of the data themselves.
Obviously, if you have access to cell phone equipment, you're going to get even more. As somebody who has access to the operator network, you can get pretty much the keys to the kingdom. You have call time, duration, call-on-call party. You have a rough location, not necessarily precise unless it's transmitted, although that is accessible with the operator's cooperation. You have data traffic, SMS traffic, and voice calls. Over the air, it's a little bit trickier. You can get the IMSI. Everyone's heard about IMSI catchers. They're being deployed everywhere at the moment. What most people don't realize is just how sensitive the IMSI is. The government treats the IMSI as unsensitive metadata. You don't need a warrant to seize it. Stingray devices are being deployed all over the place. The reality is the IMSI is a unique identifier that's attached to you as a cellular subscriber. With the IMSI, I can track your phone. And it doesn't take a lot of equipment to do that. A colleague of mine, Kristen Paget, demonstrated at DEF CON that just for a few $100s, you can build an IMSI catcher to track people. The reality is it's actually got even cheaper, because now we have these things called femtocells. And what a femtocell is a cell base station in a small box. It's the Wi-Fi router equivalent of the telco network. And these things aren't secure. Well, some of them are secure, but they're not that secure. And if you route a femtocell, or if you modify it in any way, you have a cheap IMSI catcher. In fact, more than that, you have an active base station attack. Something that previously you could only buy for $200,000, now you can buy at Walmart for about $100. What can you get with a man in the middle? Well, you get full precise location. You get data, you get voice, you get SMS traffic, and you get to substitute traffic with your own. That means you can pass malicious payloads to the browsing device. It means you can see what the user's doing. You can listen to what the user's saying. Pretty much as the operator. In fact, I would argue more than the operator, because you have the opportunity to do stuff that the operator wouldn't do because of legal constraints. A couple of years ago, I went out to China to take a look at the deal of what was going on there and exactly what the Great Firewall of China is like. The Great Firewall of China is kind of a poor term, because it's not just one system. It's a very distributed network of machines that interact with everybody and anyone who's in China. It does everything from blocking IP addresses, hijacking DNS requests, not even ones in China. If you come too close to Chinese IP space, they will substitute some of your requests. It filters by keyword. It does deep packet inspection for plain text, looking for forbidden words or forbidden strings. And most recently, in 2011, it developed the ability to look for Tor. And what they did was they built a signature detection system that looked for the handshake, the ciphering handshake that Tor did, and if they detected it, it then actively scanned the IP address they suspected and spoke Tor to it, and set up a one-hop onion circuit to validate that this was truly a Tor bridge or a Tor node, and then blocked it. That's pretty advanced stuff, and a major setback for people who love privacy, like me.
So the good thing is you don't have to rely on having perfect OPSEC 24/7, 365 to defend yourself. There are actually some tools out there that make things a lot easier. Oh, we're going to have the slides on. You don't need to. We'll have the slides up. So we're going to have. There's a bunch of tools that'll help users protect themselves. Some of these things are just regular tools that you happen to use versus other tools that are just safer to use. There's other tools that are not really so safe in their default configuration, but we can tweak them with some new settings to make them a lot safer. And then there's a bunch of tools that people have been working on really for the past maybe 15 years, but especially in the past 5 or 10 years, to sort of intentionally hide information and provide privacy. Not merely hide content, but also provide anonymity. There's some great things. Tor is probably the most successful to date, and there's a lot of other good work. And then we're introducing some new tools that are software and hardware. To start with, there's the tools that are a little bit more privacy protecting by default. There's some basic characteristics that will make a tool, I would say, generally more privacy protecting, or at least amenable to privacy than other tools. Message-based systems like email versus chat, or email versus live stream, things like that, are just generally much easier to secure. You can add latency, One of the big attacks on all these systems is you can correlate when someone's online, when they're using the traffic, and when their traffic is spiking on their local network link with a remote node. If you send email, there's less of a direct correlation, especially if it's got intermediate systems. If you've got a peer-to-peer system, it's decentralized. You don't have a single organization that has everybody's records to go after legally or extra-legally or illegally. And it's also why Bitcoin is so awesome compared to a lot of the existing financial systems. Systems that just, even if they're not totally secure, that just sort of passively encrypt everything. Like, one of my favorite things is how a lot of internet email finally in 2014 is encrypted, not because of PGP, which is an awesome message-based crypto system, but because of Start TLS. People just set up their mail servers to passively encrypt traffic that goes to other mail servers. Gmail does it for virtually everybody they talk to, except I guess for Yahoo still. Everybody who runs their own mail server should do this. It's not at all secure against an active attacker because there's really no PKI for it or anything, but against a passive adversary, it's great. So that's an example of where just sort of pervasive, passive, kind of weak encryption helps you, and then you can layer better systems on top of it. And then stuff where data and executable code are distinct is really, really important for a lot of security, and a lot of the violations of privacy of user data happen when security is subverted by an active, passive hybrid system. So those are all really important principles in general. One of the things that's actually really awesome, that's sort of one of these sort of like accidental benefits that come from something else, is that cheap hardware itself helps you a lot. If you have to worry about securing your hardware, so there's the standard for the DoD for like how you can declassify a hard drive. Essentially, it is you physically destroy the hard drive. We've basically completely given up on the ability to take a hard drive, delete data from it securely, and reuse that drive. You run it through a shredder. So the fact that the military has this crazy huge budget of like $800 billion a year lets them do that with top-of-the-line equipment. I could never do that with my personal equipment until now, where I can buy a laptop for like $200, and I can dedicate it, use it for a couple weeks, use it for a couple months, and then once it's served its purpose, I can get rid of it. Disposable hardware lets you dedicate things to tasks, so you don't have to worry about how you securely handle multiple projects on the same machine at one time. You just buy a couple separate machines and use those. And phones are even cheaper than laptops. You can buy phones, like pretty soon phones are going to be included for free with like Serial that are like unlocked phones, but you can get a smartphone now for like $50, $100 for a decent phone. So that's getting pretty crazy. And then there's the model of running live systems out of memory where you're not actually writing anything to disk makes it a lot easier to secure stuff. If it's never on the disk, it's never available to anyone else to attack. One of the problems here is, of course, getting access to this hardware. It doesn't do you a whole lot of good if you're leaving like a network monitoring device in somebody's location. If it's got a serial number and you can trace where that thing was purchased with your credit card shipped to your home address. So you want to be able to buy your hardware in a non-attributable way. Bitcoin is really awesome for this. As we saw with Sabu, there was the problem where he had some stuff shipped to his house that he shouldn't have had shipped to his house. With Bitcoin, you, of course, want to buy it through like local Bitcoins or something, but there's that.
There's a myth that Bitcoin is completely anonymous. It isn't. Because the transaction ledger is public, unless you take steps to hide your transactions in the cloud of other things going on, it's actually not too hard to trace what's going on. But the reality is the steps that somebody like Mark Capelli should have taken is things like Bitcoin tumblers, proxies that will hide your transaction in a cloud of other transactions are accessible and available. And they're relatively easy. But you just have to think about what you're doing and understand the implications. Because if you run out after drawing $500 from your cash point, from your ATM rather, and go and buy yourself a phone from AT&T, don't have any illusions that it's completely anonymous. Because it's going to take them no more than a couple of days to trace that phone to you.
And then the third part of this is the disposable accounts. So you dedicate an account to a single task. You don't run your personal email and use that to contact people for your hacking thing. You chain systems. You do all sorts of stuff like that, which is basically good OPSEC principle. The problem is it's a bit of a pain to manage all this kind of stuff. There's also VPN technology. So VPNs are kind of near and dear to my heart because I ran a VPN provider for a lot of last year, and we shut it down after the LavaBit fiasco because of some security issues or some legal policy issues that became very apparent. But you've got SSH, you've got a bunch of free VPN services you can use, commercial services that are falling to like almost $0 in cost, and then you can of course run your own VPN. The problem is they're not really terribly good for anonymity. They're really not anonymity at all. You can use them to support an anonymity system, but on their own, they're not at all anonymous. They're not end-to-end. Some of them are run by really sketchy people that like to log all your traffic and do all sorts of bad stuff to you. And a lot of them are blocked. Like, I've been trying to get Chinese users to connect to something, and it's sort of a cat and mouse game. And then you can leak data. Like, if you've got a VPN for some of your traffic, but not all of your traffic, it's often that traffic that goes around the VPN that's really interesting.
Also, same as with the burner phone, don't fool yourself into thinking that you can buy a VPN service with a credit card and then go and use that VPN service to do illegal things. Because, I mean, come on, really? The same thing is, the more public a service like that is, the less likely that it's going to fly under the radar. So if your purpose is to find a service that's going to allow you to punch through some kind of national firewall, such as the Great Firewall, then public VPN services probably aren't going to help you, because their nodes are being shut down almost as fast as they're setting them up.
So one of the best tools that's out there today is Tor. Correctly used, it will keep you anonymous, I believe, at least until it hits the exit node. And it generally works. I use it. It's a great tool, but it's got some disadvantages. It's easy to block if you know the signature. A lot of people are looking at it because it's a really interesting academic project as well as a useful tool. It's not terribly performant, and it's pretty complex. So there's a lot of potential for error, especially if you run it on your local computer with all of your sensitive data on it, not dedicated to the task. DPI and active network analysis are the greatest enemy of it. And luckily, the Tor community has a lot of great developers that are working on ways to mitigate these disadvantages. The best thing is actually to run like format transforming encryption or pluggable transports to change the way that Tor traffic looks to the outside world as it transits. They've been working on this for, I think, 3 or 4 years now, at least, and it's pretty effective, and we'll go into that.
So what the Tor project realized is that we're in a world where we have access to tools that can analyze big data. We can now take huge swaths of data and look for signatures, patterns. We can look for ways to attribute the types of services sending these things. And that means that for our traffic to stay hidden in this giant cloud, it has to become a moving target. We have to come up with ways either to hide the tree in the forest, or we have to come up with ways to make sure the tree is constantly changing shape, so that when they look at it, it's a bush, now it's a blade of grass, now it's another tree, now it's a bush, and that way no one can pin it down and track it. And that's where the pluggable transport concept is fantastic, because it's dynamic. It means you can load different modules. Right now, there's 7 live pluggable transports that you can use with Tor. There's OBFS proxy, there's Flash proxy, format transforming encryption, Scramble suite, Meek, OBS4, OBFS client, and then I think there's like 3 others which are coming live. OBS4 is by far the most popular, although format transforming encryption is probably my favorite. OBS4 is basically just an encryption layer on top of Tor TLS. It negotiates the session keys and encrypts everything between the client and server with no plain text headers. By stripping out the plain text headers, you remove the opportunity for signature detection. It's just random data that they see, makes it very difficult for them to say this is anything. It just looks like noise. There's a visual representation here which shows the difference between ordinary Tor traffic and OBS3 traffic. I couldn't find a representation for OBFS4. Essentially, it just adds additional layers onto it, but packages it inside an encrypted tunnel that makes it impossible to see. Scramble suite is another transform which aims to make it look like uniform random bytes. Similar to OBFS, it offers a few, but it offers a couple of extra features. It randomizes the size and the timing of packets, and the server also resists active probing by requiring a secret key from the client before it will respond. This is in an attempt to resist the active probing done by the Great Firewall and other sensor systems that are coming online. Flash proxy allows the creation and utilization of very sudden, short-lived JavaScript-based proxies. They don't do much to try and hide it, but they set it up in a way that you can just create a cloud of browsers and have them just create a Flash network very quickly, put it up rapidly. Doesn't matter if it gets found, because hopefully you've used it by then, and it can pop up another one, and new ones can come up as fast as old ones are taken down. Format transforming encryption is my favorite. This encodes data in a way that it matches an arbitrary regular expression. The idea is they've looked at how most of these censoring systems automatically identify traffic and attribute it to a type of traffic. Most of the time it's just a regular expression that looks for particular byte sequences or looks for particular keywords, and they map it to various things. So the example you can see below is they've encoded the Tor traffic so it looks like SSH traffic. It's not perfect. It doesn't stand up to manual scrutiny, but it does fool automatic systems. And at the end of the day, we know that manual inspection of this traffic is too expensive. They can't afford to manually inspect everything. So they rely on their automated systems to flag things of interest and drill into it. So long as you can do something that keeps you under the radar and that avoids the manual inspection, it doesn't matter if it doesn't stand up to manual scrutiny.
And one of the disadvantages for the attacker is that those automated systems have to run incredibly fast. They're running on 10 gigabit Ethernet links, multiple links, and they can't add too much latency to the system. They have to be reliable and everything else. I've worked on a high-speed proxy that needs to do the same kind of thing, and we worry about microseconds. So you really don't have a lot of processing time to do this kind of pattern matching in IDS.
We'll put the rest up in the slide so you can skip through. One last one that I particularly like, Banana Phone. What Banana Phone does is it takes a literary construct, a library of keywords, and it uses that to disguise it as something that resembles natural language. Again, if you look at it, it doesn't stand up to manual scrutiny. But when it comes to automatic detection, it's going to be very hard for the system to flag it.
And there's an expansion factor, of course, so there's inefficiency, but again, you've got really fast links now because stuff is so cheap and there's video streamed to your devices, so you can afford a 100-time expansion factor if you're sending text. So outside of the Tor world, there are still a bunch of great tools. There's some that have been around since, I think, 1998 was when DNS Tunnel was proposed on BugTrack, which I actually remember, and there's HTTP Tunnel. There's various other systems that effectively tunnel one kind of traffic in another kind of traffic. The idea being that, well, DNS Tunnel has a couple purposes. DNS Tunnel is also so you don't have to pay for internet at your hotel. You can bypass the authentication thing. But it also means that DNS traffic isn't usually very suspicious, so people just sort of let it go by. And then HTTP traffic is also not usually suspicious, so they just let it go by.
The two obvious limitations with both of these is that you have to have servers that speak these tunneling protocols ready and waiting to catch your connection. That means you have to kind of preset everything up and have the infrastructure waiting, and if it's just you setting up some infrastructure for yourself, you can guarantee that it's going to get flagged eventually and it's probably not going to stay around forever. The big advantage of Tor is there is a network of ready proxies growing all the time there to connect to your session.
Although it's even worse if you tried to use a commercial provider that ran one IP for DNS Tunnel or something with a bunch of people using it, it would get shut down in like a very short time. So the problem we see all here is that there's really no silver bullet. All this stuff is hard. There's a bunch of incremental things that'll give you small advantages. They're hard to use. And if you screw up, there's a lot of bad stuff that happens to you. You might have your photo taken on the beach, which is one thing that bad happened to you. But these MC catchers and IMEI monitoring, it's how we target drones to shoot missiles out of the sky to like people that are driving around in their cars. So some people really don't want to be located. So it only takes one mistake to screw up, and it's really hard for humans to not make mistakes. It is, however, really easy for computers to only make the same mistake over and over again and not make new mistakes each time. So we think there's an opportunity to use software tools to sort of automate the meta process here for all this stuff.
One of the ideas behind the concept is we can't solve all of the problems. You're going to end up with a system that's so complex that by the time you've created it, some part of it's going to be obsolete and not worthy. But what we figure is if we aim at the low-hanging fruit, the stuff that there is tools and technology, for example, like Tor, out there to solve, you can solve 50 or 60% of the problem of reducing the metadata. And that allows you to spend the rest of your time and focus all of your energy on the remaining section, which means there's less chance of mistake. You're not going to make a mistake in the bit that's being done automatically, And hopefully you can put some additional effort into ensuring that the bit you do is done right.
So we thought about this. I've been working on this since kind of October 2010, and thinking about it, talking with Mark, talking with Gruck and a few other people, trying to figure out what the best approach to solve this is. Everyone's moving to the cloud for everything, but this is one of those things where you actually can't use the cloud as your only solution because what would you connect to, and it's the whole monitoring problem. So it doesn't make any sense. Client software, it's like 2014, and it's still a pain to write client software, even for one platform. But if I wrote something that only worked on like FreeBSD, people would complain that there's no Linux version, there's no Mac version, no Windows version, and then trying to keep something that you're actively developing in sync on all these platforms is a huge pain. Plus, you want to use it on iPhone and Android. Then you have to get approval from this like walled garden to be able to deploy software there.
PGP is an effective suite. You use it right, it effectively encrypts your encryption, yet its adoption rate is terrible. Most places, the only reason it gets used is because it's mandated. Various companies insist that you have to use it as part of their policy. How many of you know people who aren't in our community, who aren't geeks, that use PGP at home? Almost none. Why? Because there's an overhead in getting this thing set up and managing it and using it. I actually, in my day job, work in the cell phone business, and we did a survey not so long ago on a really simple security measure, the PIN code on your phone. How many people do you think implement a PIN code on their phone? The answer is roughly 50%. And the reason given, the number one reason, is four-digit PIN is too difficult to manage.
So there's cool stuff like the Tor browser bundle, which sort of has the same problems with client software. And some of the most secure systems we have right now are VM or bootable image systems like Tails. They work pretty well. It's still a pain to have to run VMs on your system and everything else. You have to use different tools inside the VM, and it's kind of clunky. And it doesn't work on mobile phones or tablets. There still, surprisingly, is no great virtualization system for mobile phones. I'm really surprised by that, but it doesn't exist yet. And the other option is to use dedicated or disposable hardware. So you've got your work laptop, your personal laptop, your secret project laptop, your other malware analysis laptop, and pretty soon you're not going to be like carrying this stuff around with you. And what happens if you're out and you only have one of your laptops and you need to use your other laptop to do something? It's just, then they can just find the guy who's carrying 5 laptops and pick him up. So it's not really so great. So we thought about it, and we thought about what is the small device that you want to have for some other benefits that you carry around with you or could carry around with you everywhere that will actually be able to run all the software, all these tools on the device. And we thought that a custom secure travel router is actually the sweet spot for all this stuff. It mitigates a lot of the disadvantages of this stuff and is an easy way to deploy these tools.
The reasons travel routers are great, they're super cheap. I remember when travel routers were something that was about the size of a hardback book and it cost a couple $100. Now you can go and buy little routers from TP-Link for about $20 to $25, which run Linux and which are flashable and which have all the hardware features that you might want to take advantage of to do something cool.
Yeah, people use these when they go to hotels and they want to share their network with their cell phone, their Kindle, their tablet, their like wife's computer, their computer, all these like 5 or 6 devices, and they get charged per MAC address by the hotel or per connection. Or if they want to have a cell phone connection, they want to share it with a bunch of devices. So there's actually pretty good reasons to use these things that are totally unrelated to security. So that's why they're so cheap. They're not a security product. They're a save you money on paying for Wi-Fi at hotels and make it easier to connect product. So they're really price sensitive. They're made by these Chinese companies that make them super cheap, and they're everywhere.
Of course, the other advantage is if you're going to use something as a hardware security product and you're going to take it into hot zones like, for example, China, you don't want a security product that screams security product. Because if you take out something that looks like a spy tool and you set it up in your hotel room, you can pretty much guarantee you're going to get a visit from the PLA within a few minutes. Using something that almost every other business traveler has, or at least looks like something that every other business traveler has, and stands up to some reasonable scrutiny, is a massive advantage.
And the other advantage for us is that they're actually really easy to program for. They're system on chip, they're Linux based, there's OpenWRT, there's DWRT. They're really simple to work with. They're not as simple as like general purpose computers, but they're still pretty simple to work with. You can't really self-host the development environment, but if you're familiar with Arduinos and with Raspberry Pis and things like that, then it's pretty easy to do all this stuff. So we weren't the only people who ever came up with this idea. There's actually several projects in this space. Of course, there's the Pogo Plug, which is sort of like a plug-in wall wart kind of company that used to be for sharing USB drives. They came up with something called the Safe Plug, which is a device that's not really portable. It's designed for home network connection. It runs basic Tor, doesn't do pluggable transport. It's pretty basic. I've never actually seen one in person. There's the Onion Pi, which Adafruit, which is this awesome New York-based hardware hacker company, has. It's really a Raspberry Pi plus a bunch of other stuff. And as far as I can tell, it's as much a learning tool for people to really experiment with the Raspberry Pi to do a practical thing as it is a finished product. But it's a pretty awesome tool. It's very configurable. You should totally check it out. And then there's Portal, which the Gruck, this awesome hacker, came up with. I think 2011 was when he started working on it, maybe a little bit before. Basically, he started out really focused on Tor and pluggable transports. And when I found out this thing existed on the internet, I mailed him and I met up with him a couple times and talked with him about it. It does a lot of what I want, and it's a lot of the hardware that I want, but it doesn't really have all the tools. So he was limited in his bandwidth to sort of work on the tools. So we worked on it together, which is great.
But it didn't do enough, so we hacked it. And now?
So we've been working on it for a while. It's basically dedicated hardware. It's a Qualcomm Atheros AR9331 chipset with 64 megs of RAM and 16 megs of ROM. It's a pretty low-end computer. It's a 400 megahertz, like MIPS 24K, but for what we need, it's pretty awesome. We built some images for it. It's got Ethernet ports, USB ports. The idea is that it has multiple network interfaces, some of which are on the high side or the unencrypted side, the raw data side, some of which are on the public side where only encrypted traffic is going, so you can keep those separated in the device itself. It's got a USB port, so you can plug in a 3G or 4G modem. The cool thing when you go to China is you can actually buy or rent or buy a cheap USB modem plus like a week of service for like $20. So instead of worrying about roaming cellular phones, you just buy one of those things, plug it in, use IP services for everything. And rather than just working with Tor itself, we added a lot of other transforms and tools to it. So we built a GUI for it, make it manageable, everything else.
The idea behind it is to take all of the flexibility and simplicity of a travel router, the power of something like Tor, pluggable transports, and to make it really easy to use. So you can simply go in, set it up, choose which transports you want to use, enable them, and run them. But most importantly, something that's pretty simple and gives you a very visual confirmation that it's functioning and it's doing what it's supposed to do. Because one of the biggest issues I have with Tor is that sometimes your circuit can go down and before you're realizing it, you're actually sending stuff out over the browser and it's not encrypted. And sure, you can check it by going and checking what your IP address is and seeing if it's one of the Tor ones, but the reality is it's not hard to make a tool that does that and have it flag you the moment something goes wrong.
And the nice thing about it being a physically separate device is it's really easy to conceptually understand. It's really hard for me to understand what a piece of software is doing when it's on a machine, especially if it's running like Mac or Windows or something and I don't really understand every piece of software on that machine. There's all sorts of stuff that can interact. If it's a piece of hardware that only connects by one cable and you pull the cable, it's not connected. So that's a very simple principle. And I did some defense contracting and I saw how the government side of all this stuff works. They rely extensively on hardware crypto. They don't worry about software modules or everything to the extent possible. It's all hardware modules, physical cables, easy tracking. They worry about serial numbers, tracing everything. Much, much simpler way to operate that when you're in an environment that's either high stress or lots of users, or maybe some of your users aren't quite as smart as some of your other users, and something can go wrong, it will go wrong, you make sure the tools are as simple to use as possible.
So at the end of the day, monitoring is pervasive. It's here to stay. We can do a lot to change it. We can ensure that all our applications are using encrypted transports at their back end. We can ensure we use HTTPS all the time. The reality is only 6% of traffic is using SSL, and it's only gone up like 5% in the last 12 months. It's not going to change radically. So we need to take radical steps to protect ourselves because they are monitoring. And whether you want to protect your privacy because you're just an ordinary user who wants to ensure that you don't get flagged and your traffic isn't spied on, or whether you're someone who's doing high-risk activities and you want to stay safe, extraordinary steps need to be taken.
So we've got some boards.
Yeah, we're not quite... we're not quite ready for demo, and to be honest, it's a little bit pointless to do a show and tell from this distance and this size of a room. But look, circuit boards.
These are cheap commodity boards. These systems will not be expensive. You'll be able to use whatever hardware. It's all open source software, so it'll be, because there's no way you could trust a closed source piece of software to keep you safe for this kind of thing. And it'll be easy to use.
One of the amusing things I did over the weekend was playing with this. I plugged in a GSM board and activated my own little base station running OpenBTS, and found that actually I can run quite a secure telephone network. The only downside is it's obviously very illegal.
Which is a downside sometimes.
Educational purposes only.
So we'd be happy to take questions. No comment. Yes, we will. Twitter @Octal. Follow. I'll tweet the location.
Thank you very much.
So it'll be twitter.com/octal, OCTAL, for the slide deck. One more thing tonight will be coming up shortly. Just as a friendly reminder, you know, it's very easy to lose track of time when you're at these events. This is just something that'll help remind folks. Something that we've kind of figured out after 20 years of doing these events to help maximize your experience here. And I mentioned it earlier tonight. They are going to mention this a few times during these events, particularly these times of day. A good way to make sure that you have the best experience possible. 521 is something we've been saying a few times. If you want to have the best experience possible, we highly recommend making sure that each day you get 5 hours of sleep, 2 square meals, 1 shower. Cheers. Shady.org. Good question. We were hoping to actually live demo one here, but we managed to have setbacks with the UI. I'm hoping to have a demoable one by DEFCON in a few weeks' time. So hopefully at least by the end of this year.
always pays off.
I have no voice and I must scream. Okay. To wrap things up today, the first day of hope, dissent is our theme of this conference. And, well, this is one vision of what might happen if we fail in our mission. And to bring us that vision, well, whatever. Johannes is the head of Monochrome. He's been doing amazing countercultural art in Vienna as part of Monochrome for what, 20 years? Yeah. 20 years now. 2 years ago, he came here to tell us about another project of his, Sierra Zulu, and this time he is here to show us a new work of his. I can't even say it because I can't say it because I do not. German is one of the languages I can't speak without completely butchering it. All right, so everyone, before we begin the movie, Johannes will tell us a little more about it, and he will also bribe us with candy.
Get the candy. More. Pass it on. Pass on the candy. I promise candy. No popcorn because I don't like popcorn, so you have to eat candy. So, okay. So, wonderful.